Hello, and welcome to another episode of NantenJex Talks, and in this episode, I want to talk about SNES Online. So as I record this, the latest SNES releases are Wrecking Crew 98, Super R-Type, Awesome Hebe Reke, and then in Japan they got Marvelous and Other Treasure Island. And this got me thinking about what other SNES games we might expect to see come to the service. And I wrote a whole Twitter thread about it, I did a Famiboards thread about it, chatted with other people who might know, who care about this sort of stuff like I do. And I sort of came to a list of games by Nintendo, ones that either all these games they published, they might have only published it in one region, but they published at least somewhere, and games that they're also sort of associated with, so they may not have published it, but they did develop on it or work on it. And I created this list of about 62 games that are still left to come to NSO that Nintendo had some involvement with, just to see if I could figure out what games we might expect. And I wanted to share my findings with you. If you have read my thread or Famiboards thing, this is still worth listening to, because I've slightly updated it with all the new information that the people were kind enough to share with me by writing them out in the comments and pointing out where I had made mistakes. Always fun. Anyway, so now the total results of this are that there are 62 games that Nintendo is involved with in some way that are still left to come on the NSO for the Super Nintendo part of it. Out of those 62, 22 will almost certainly get added to the platform. In my opinion, of course. There might be, you never know, but in my opinion there are 22 that will definitely come to the platform, which is about, just over a third. And then there's another 22 that might come to the platform, dependent on certain factors, either from Nintendo themselves or potentially the game has a certain rights holder that they'd need to negotiate with that actually has a chance, because not every right holder is going to add something on NSO. And then that leaves 18 games that won't come out at all for the platform. And let's go through that, shall we? And we'll start with the pessimistic side of this. Let's go through the 18 games that won't come to the platform. First up, we have games that won't come to the platform because of who has the rights to them. And starting this off is everyone's favourite JRPG maker, Square Enix, who haven't put anything out on NSO yet and have a tendency to publish any retro games themselves and actually charge people money for it rather than giving it away for free in this service. And the games that they're involved with on this list are Arkanoid, Do It Again, Space Invaders, Terranigma, Illusion of Gaia, Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Some of these games are Taito games, which Square Enix owns, and no Taito game has been on the service, so we can just assume that if Square has a hand in it, it probably won't happen unless it's like an equal shared thing, which is one game we'll come to later. But those are the Square games that probably won't come out. They're not the only publisher though. Capcom, there's Mega Man X. Mega Man X is technically already available on Switch to buy as part of a collection, so it's very unlikely to be coming to NSO. I wouldn't expect it. And then Disney have two games that Nintendo are involved in. I can never pronounce this. Maui Mallard in Cold Shadow and Pinocchio. Nintendo published the SNES versions of both of these games in all regions, and Disney own them. And Disney, similar to Square Enix, have also been publishing older games like the Lion King game and the Jungle Book game as their own thing. So they're probably more likely to re-release this and charge people than put it on NSO. Lastly, there are a couple more games on here that probably won't come on. First off, there's games that have legal issues that prevent them from being added to the service, which includes one Nintendo game itself. The Nintendo game is Uniracers, or Unirally in Europe, and it was a game made to try and rival Sonic and show that the SNES could also do the speed that Sonic was known for, but Nintendo got sued by Pixar because the unicycle that is the main character looks very similar to the unicycle that they made in some shorts, and so Pixar sued them and Pixar won. and so Uniracer had to be completely recalled. Now this is an interesting one because from the Giga leak, it does look like Nintendo has the ROM and has tested the ROM on services like NSO, but they probably won't release it ever. There's just too much legal risk there. If Pixar turn around and like, hey, what are you doing? Then they could get in trouble because they already lost the case once. So I just don't think they'll bother releasing it. And then the other game on this that falls into this category is Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures. Now, Nintendo published this back in the day, but any recent re-release has been done by Bandai Namco themselves. However, the game contains Miss Pac-Man in it, and now Miss Pac-Man is a legal grey area for Bandai Namco, and they've just been avoiding her like the plague. And because of that, Pac-Man 2 also wasn't part of the Pac-Man collection that came out recently, and so I just think they won't bother releasing Pac-Man 2. It's not even that popular of a game outside of people online who know it's bad and want to play it for that reason. So that one won't be happening. Other legally rights issues, any game that involves actual real-life people is going to struggle to get onto the service. This mostly affects sports games. Ken Griffey Jr. Major League Baseball, Ken Griffey Jr. Winning Run, NHL Stanley Cup, NCAA Basketball, and Superplay Action Football are all sports games that use real likenesses of people. The Ken Griffey ones are obvious, because it's in the title. Because there's no version of these games where the characters have been edited out, like say Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, where they then released a Punch-Out featuring Mr. Dream and replaced Mike Tyson, use that version going forward. Because of that, if Nintendo wants to put these games on the service, they're either going to have to mod them to remove all the names and likenesses, which seems like a lot of effort, or they're going to have to go back and get the licenses for all these people. And I just don't see them doing that for some random sports games, even if the Ken Griffey ones were quite popular in America. So that's not going to happen. And similarly, Unaki 30 Same Game is a Mario puzzle game that's connected. Unaki 30 is a Japanese radio show program, and Unaki 30 is a weird game. It was made by Hudson Soft. They eventually remade it, but got removed all the Unaki 30 references, replaced the Mario characters with Hudson characters, and then released it as a cartridge. That version could come out, but the Unaki 30 Same Game with Mario characters is not only weirdly tied to this radio show, but it was originally made as a special prize for people who won a contest, and so there's very limited versions of it, and it's never been released officially as something that you can buy. It's just been available in Satellaview and then this little prize win. And so because of that, I don't think Nintendo's ever going to bother releasing it. Ever. So if you want to play this game, you'll have to hope that the Hudson version, Same Game, gets added onto the service at some point, but that has nothing to do with Nintendo outside of this weird connection. And that's it. Those are the 18 games that I would never expect to be on this service. Now let's go to the ones that might come to this service, and I'll explain the condition that needs to be met in order for them to arrive. So first are any game with a licensing problem. This includes Snoopy Concert, Yoshi's Cookie, SimCity, Tetris 2, and Mini Yonko Let's 'Em Go Power WGP 2. All of these have some kind of licensing issue. For example, Mini Yonko is a manga series, or the game is based on a manga series. And so if Nintendo wants to go on there, to get this on there, they'll have to get the license from the manga holders, who I forget off the top of my head. I should have written it down. Now, usually I would say, it's not going to happen, like I did with the Disney one, but the difference is Nintendo has done this already on NSO with Quest for Camelot on the Game Boy, where they would have had to have gotten the license from Warner Brothers. So they are kind of willing, if it's worth it. And given that this is a game that they did publish, in fact, on the Super Nintendo, it was a very late Super Nintendo title, only released in Japan, I should add, they might make the effort. Similarly, SimCity and Tetris 2 are both games that have been previously... SimCity, I should say. SimCity and Yoshi's Cookie are both games that have been previously re-released on Virtual Console in the past. But so Nintendo has been willing to get the license from EA for SimCity and then from the Tetris company for Yoshi's Cookie, which has a weird big licensing problem behind it. that has led to Nintendo barely ever touching the game. But they might do it, because they did it once before. So SimCity and Yoshi's Cookie, and then Tetris 2, speaking of Tetris Company, Nintendo published it, but the Super Nintendo version was done fully by the Tetris Company. And so they would need to be involved in this, and they might do. Unlike a lot of weird Tetris spin-offs, Tetris 2 is fairly standard Tetris. So if they were interested, they might put it on NSO. But it's up to the Tetris Company, more so than it is Nintendo for this one. And then lastly, Snoopy Concert's a weird one. It was made by Nintendo, like developed in-house, but it wasn't published by them at all. And obviously it's connected to the Snoopy license. So we would need the license holder for Snoopy to want to have it on the service, and then also the publisher of the game to also want to have it on the service. That's a lot of steps. I don't know if Nintendo will do it, but I included it on here simply because I think it's more likely than the Disney or Square Enix ones. But there is another issue actually with Snoopy Concert, that it was a game that used the SNES mouse. And at the moment, the emulators I think have been tested for SNES mouse, but it's not available on any game, so Nintendo would have to make that available. And who knows if they ever will. If they do though, then that opens it up to a whole host of other games that we could see be added to the service. Mario Paint, Mario and Wario, and then if they get the Super Scope as well, Battle Clash, Metal Combat Falcon's Revenge, Super Scope 6, and Yoshi's Safari could all become available. All of these games have been tested on the emulator, according to the GigaLeak. So we know that Nintendo has looked into having all of these run on NSO. They just need to figure out some way of getting it emulated properly for people to try. SNES mouse should be easier. In fact, you can actually plug in a regular mouse to the Switch and use it, so they could do that pretty simply. Super Scope is obviously a lot harder. They made the NES Zapper available on the Wii U, but that because they had the Wii's pointing controls to work with. Could do the same here because they let you use touchscreen on the Wii U as well. Maybe these games can work by just using touchscreen to emulate the Super Scope shots. Who knows? But that's the only way these games will get on here if Nintendo actually makes that effort, so that's why they're not a guarantee. Also connected to this is Tin Star, which is another Nintendo game that used the Super Scope, but one that I'm not sure they care about, which leads to this next category. Does Nintendo care? Tin Star was a game made only for America by a Manchester, UK-based studio that's not around anymore. As far as I understand it, Nintendo fully owned the rights to this game, but it's a weird situation like the Cruisin' series where they own it, they don't do anything with it. I think only like a handful of people know that they own it because they never reference it, they never test it on anything. It's bizarre. But it could happen if Nintendo really wanted to and run out of games. It could happen. The other game in this category is the Picross Nintendo Power Volumes 1 through 8 collection. That's 8 games. Japan-only Picross games. Each one was made to promote an upcoming or existing Nintendo games. There's like Mario 64, Donkey Kong Country, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Picross game. Only released on Nintendo Power. Now, according to the GigaLeak, they have tested volumes 1 through 4. So they are interested, potentially, in adding it to the service. But it's a weird one. So, because they're very small games, and they'd have to release them individually. So that's like 8 whole things you're adding to the service. But it's Picross. It could also be released worldwide because it's Picross. Like, it's really easy to play. I've played them all. So that could happen. Do they care enough? The last 2 games in this category are Street Fighter Alpha 2, which the only reason it's here and not on the won't be on, because Street Fighter Alpha 2 you can technically play through the Street Fighter collection, but that version of it is the arcade version, whereas this would be the Super Nintendo version. And Capcom had no issue putting Street Fighter 2 Genesis on the Mega Drive NSO, so they could not care for the Super Nintendo one and just drop that on here. So it's not impossible. I'd say it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And then the last one of these is Vegas Stakes, a game that Nintendo published and is owned by HAL Labs, who Nintendo is obviously very close with. And it was released on the Virtual Console on the Wii, so there's precedent for it being re-released. The only reason I put it here in the might category is because it's a gambling game. And gambling legislations and how you can depict gambling in video games has gotten a lot stricter over the years. And so this could be a weird case where if Nintendo did want to release Vegas Stakes, they'd have to make an 18 plus SNES app like they've done in Japan with the 18 plus 64 app. And they might not be bothered to do that for just Vegas Stakes. So we'll see. That's why that one's in the maybe category. I'm not a legal expert. I've never also played Vegas Stakes, so maybe the gambling in it isn't as bad as I'm thinking, but who knows? And that leads us to the final 2022, the final 22 games that I think will definitely come to NSO at some point. Let's start with the third-party ones. Super Pinball, Behind the Mask, Kid Clown in Crazy Chase, Soccer Shootout, and Plock. These four, Nintendo published in specific regions, but didn't publish worldwide. So they're the four least likely, but these are all games where the rights are kind of... They're either games that people aren't particularly bothered about. Soccer Shootout, I believe, was made by Capcom. Nintendo's obviously close with Capcom. This isn't a game that they're likely to be ever re-releasing. It's also a game that doesn't have any real people in it. They had fake footballers and stuff. So it could easily just drop on in the same way Super Tennis did already. And then Super Pinball, Kid Clown, Plock. The rights are all with individual people like Plock. The rights of the Plock are with its two creators. And they seem like they would be interested in getting Plock on NSO. And here's an interesting fact, actually, something for me to look into as well. Plock and TinStar are made by the same people. So if they own the rights to Plock, maybe they might also individually own the rights to TinStar, and that could explain why that's never been brought up. The obvious difference here being that Nintendo fully published TinStar, whereas Plock was only published by Nintendo in Europe and published by other companies elsewhere. So the rights for the publishing aren't really a thing anymore. But the game itself is owned by the developers, and if they want to get it on NSO, Nintendo might be willing. It's a pretty easy one. I think a lot of people want Plock on there. As for the third-party games that Nintendo themselves did publish, there's, and published fully, I should add, there's Derby Stallion 98, Power Load Runner, Power Soccerban, Super International Cricket, and Winter Gold. Super International Cricket is similar to Soccer Shootout in that it doesn't use real people in it, so that's fine. Obviously, the weird thing with Super International Cricket and Winter Gold is that they were both Europe only when they came out. So they would have to, like... I mean, that makes them feel less likely because only Nintendo of Europe would care to push it. But it's not impossible. And Nintendo can do it pretty easily. Power Load Run and Derby Stallion are both Nintendo-done games that are licensed from bigger games. And so... could work. They'd probably both be Japan only. Derby Stallion would definitely be Japan only. Power Load Runner could go either way. Power Soccerban is in a similar category to this, but I think Falcon Ltd, who own just the Soccerban game concept, probably don't care. They'll probably be A-okay with Nintendo putting this on the service. Again, this is one that was Japan only, but Soccerban is an easy enough understand gameplay system that they'll probably just release it for everybody. The next two games are also Nintendo published third parties, but they're ones that have been released on the Virtual Console in previous generations. That's Super Mario RPG, which obviously has a remake that came out last year, so I wouldn't expect to see it on the service at all for like at least 5 more years. But I don't think it's impossible, given that Link's Awakening is on the service and there's a remake of it. So I think if enough time passes, Nintendo will be okay with re-releasing that. And then Metal Slader Glory Director's Cut is a game made by HAL Labs and published by Nintendo on the SNES. The original NES version was all HAL Labs. Nintendo had nothing to do with it, so it's not one of their IP. It's a HAL game. But this one they have re-released on the Virtual Console in the past, so they might do it again. But it will be a Japan-only one because it's basically a visual novel adventure game. They're not going to translate it. It's not that popular enough anyway. Leave that to HAL if they want to really translate it and bring it over. But it won't be on NSO at that point. Then, okay, speaking of Virtual Console, here are a few more games. These ones are the Japan-only titles that have all been released on the Virtual Console in the past, and so I don't see any problem with them coming over to NSO. That's Fire Emblem Thracia 776, Super Famicom Wars, Famicom Detective Club Part 2, Heisei Shin Onigashima Part 1 and Part 2, and then Famicom Bunko Hajimari no Mori. There's one more as well, but these ones I think are the Virtual Console games that will come to NSO, but only the Japan side of NSO. And that's because all of these involve dialogue that Nintendo won't be bothered to localize, and so it won't make any sense to put them on the Western NSO because you just won't understand what's going on with them. Similarly to Super Mario RPG, Famicom Detective Club Part 2 got a remake, so I wouldn't expect to see the SNES or NES versions of that game get added to the service anytime soon, but they will happen eventually, I'm pretty certain. As for other Japan-only games that won't release on the Virtual Console, there's Shigesato Itoi's Bass Fishing No. 1, which we know from the Giga Leak has been tested, and then Zoo 2 Mahjong, which is a Mahjong game. Both of these could, in theory, be released on both in the West and Japan, even though the originals were Japan only, because they're not as dialogue heavy. But I don't know if they will bother, because Mahjong is such a Japan-dependent thing that I don't think anyone... Like, they didn't bother putting Yakuman on the Western NSO, despite the fact that you very easily could do, assuming someone knows how to play Mahjong outside of Japan. Like... Which is what I think Nintendo's like, if someone's already knows how to play Mahjong, they either speak Japanese or they don't care about it being on the Western one. So forget it. And then Bass Fishing, it's just fishing, so it's easy enough to understand. I haven't played it really to know how much dialogue is needed, but it could go either way. One that will, though, is Sute Hakon, which you've seen, you should have seen, if you've been on my channel long enough, the video I did about it. Go watch that after this. In fact, I'll put it at the end of this video as one of the links. Sute Hakon is a puzzle game. It doesn't need it to be translated to understand what's going on. It's been on Virtual Console in the past. Sute Hakon is basically a guarantee to be added to the service, and similar to Wrecking Crew 98, added to both sides of the service. So we'll see that probably sooner rather than later. And then that leaves us with two games. The final two games are Wario's Woods, the Super Nintendo version, and Dr. Mario and Tetris, which in Japan is actually just Dr. Mario. There's no reason why these won't come to the service. Back in the Virtual Console day, they tended to only release one version of these games on Virtual Console rather than both. Like Dr. Mario, they only did the Game Boy version on the 3DS and not the NES version, and vice versa on the Wii U and Wii. But now, I don't think they care. I mean, they released Dr. Mario on NES and Game Boy NSO, so they may as well release it on Super Nintendo NSO as well. And technically, thanks to Dr. Mario 64, it's also on 64 NSO, even though that is technically a different game. I don't think they care. So these will definitely come. It's time for another editor's insert, because as I was making this, I realised that there were a few other points I should probably bring up to have this video feel complete. Two more games that are worth mentioning, and then one whole service that's worth mentioning. So let's start with that, the Satellaview games. I saw a lot of comments from like the threads I was making about people wondering about the Satellaview titles, like the third Famicom Detective Club game, the BS Legend of Zelda titles, the Excite Bike Mario game. None of those will come to NSO. Nintendo's never re-released those, and I think a big reason why is because unlike fans who are fine with doing modded versions of these games without the dialogue that goes over, without it all being like split up into segments that you had to play, like Nintendo want that authentic experience. So if they were to do the Satellaview games, they had to do BS Legend of Zelda, for example, they would want to implement all of the dialogue, all of the recordings back, and also have it split up into like timed sections again, because they designed the game that way, so they want it to feel like an actual dedicated experience, which just will not work on NSO, so I just don't think they'll release it. If they were to go to the effort of bringing Satellaview games back, they would be doing it as like a paid thing, not on NSO. And the other two titles not to expect are Mario is Missing and Mario's Time Machine. While they were both on the Super Nintendo, both with the Mario license, similar to Yoshi's Cookie, they weren't actually developed by Nintendo or published by Nintendo, it was just the license. And unlike Yoshi's Cookie, where Nintendo developed at least one version of it, so there's a connection, I feel like they viewed Mario's Time Machine and Mario's Missing in the same way that they view Hotel Mario and the CDI games, as these weird products of the time that aren't really canon at all and just won't ever get acknowledged by Nintendo proper. So don't expect either of those games to get added to the service either, not unless Nintendo is really desperate. Okay, on to the conclusion. So yeah, to sum it all up, in a TLDR, for those who are just skipping now to the end for some reason, games that will definitely come to NSO: Wario's Woods, Dr. Mario Tetris, Sute Hakon, Itoi Bass Fishing, Zoo2 Mahjong, Fire Emblem Thracia 776, Super Famicom Wars, Famicom Detective Club Part 2, Shin Onigashima Part 1, Heisei Shin Onigashima Part 2, Famicom Bunko Hajimari no Mori, Metal Slader Glory Director's Cut, Super Mario RPG, Derby Stallion 98, Power Load Runner, Power Sukaban, Super International Cricket, Winter Gold, Plock, Soccer Shootout, Kid Clown in Crazy Chase, Super Pinball Behind the Mask. And ones that might come: Snoopy Concert, Yoshi's Cookie, SimCity, Tetris 2, Mini Yonko and Let's Go, Power WGP 2, Vegas Stakes, Mario Paint, Mario and Wario, Battle Clash, Metal Combat Falcon's Revenge, Super Scope 6, Yoshi's Safari, Street Fighter Alpha 2, Tin Star, and Picross Nintendo Power Volumes 1 through 8. They should all flash on the screen as I say that. And yeah, that's it. Obviously, I've only included the Nintendo published games here. There's plenty of third-party titles on the platform that will almost certainly be added to the service. But I hope this gives you an idea of A, what to expect, but B, also what Nintendo themselves actually have left to add. Because I know a lot of people complain about the slow output of Super Famicom and SNES games and NES games as well onto the service, and a bit of Game Boy games as well. But this should sort of explain why, because I'm hyped for Sudi Hakon coming to the service. I'd be interested in Wario's Woods and Super Famicom Wars coming to the service, and Plock is great. But I don't know how much the average person gives a crap about any of those games I just listed. I think the most hyped thing from this list of possible games that could come out, is if they do add the mouse support, and then they'll throw Mario Paint on there, and everyone will get excited for that. Picross would actually be the best thing to add on here, because Picross is also very cool, and this is a Nintendo-themed Picross, which makes it better. But yeah, I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you all for listening to me ramble once again.